Okay, well, now it's not letting me share. Let me try it one more time here. Screen share. There. Okay,
There you go.
all right.
Okay, we do have some attendees that are able to see the webinar now. I'd like to thank everybody for coming today to hear about the latest draft of the City of Amarillo zoning rewrite project. We do have Tyson Smith and Kelly Cousineau, as well as Andrew Freeman and Emily Kohler, who are with the Planning Department. My name is Chris Valverde. I'm the Assistant Director of Planning Department. And I want to be thoughtful of everybody's time. And so with that, I'll go ahead and turn that over to Tyson, and he can kind of explain maybe some of the housekeeping as far as some how to ask questions and interact with us on this webinar here. So Tyson, go right ahead.
Okay, you bet. Hello, everyone. Thanks for being with us tonight. Many of you remember we started this project a little over a year and a half ago now. And we are bringing forth now the final iteration of the zoning ordinance, at least the final version for consideration by the city, by the citizens, and also eventually for recommendation by the Planning and Zoning Commission, and then eventually the City Council. Tonight's meeting will be the first of about 6 meetings over the next 2 or 3 months. And in fact, we'll be having a second public meeting this week on Thursday night. So tonight won't be the last time you'll see this, far from it. In fact, tonight is merely the first time. We'll go through where we've been throughout the project, and then Kelly Cousineau from our office here at White and Smith will take you through some of the big changes to the code. There are a lot of changes to the code. So we're happy to touch on any area after we've presented that you want more detail on. There'll be a Q&A time. Also feel free as we're going along to use the virtual hand raising tool there in the Zoom feature. And if we see that, we'll stop and take your questions as we go along. We don't want to get too far from a particular subject matter before hearing your question. You can also enter your questions into the chat on the Zoom platform as well, and we'll pick them up there. We'll have to unmute you to hear your question. So do indicate you have a question through the virtual hand or the chat. So let's start here. We'll go over how we've gotten to where we are now. And then Kelly, as I said, will walk us through an overview of the final zoning ordinance, the major changes, and then we'll talk in a bit more detail about what we can expect over the next few months. We kicked this project off in June of 2019. We had a few days of meetings with stakeholders and the public and the steering committee and with staff, and that's really where we got our feet wet on the situation in Amarillo and identifying initial needs for the community and what changes might be considered. The first thing we did was prepare an assessment of the zoning ordinance. These materials are all online, by the way, on the city website, and Kelly will cover that in a moment. But that assessment allowed us to assemble in one place what we heard you as the community say you needed or would like to have us look at during the course of the project. We drafted the project in 3 modules, module 1, 2, and 3. The first we brought to you last February, the next in June, and then the third in October. And obviously the second 2 were done virtually as the onset of the pandemic hit, about the time we started presenting iterations of the draft. In the first module, we covered an executive summary, included an executive summary and an introduction to the new revised zoning ordinance. But that section also included zoning districts and use tables and use regulations. And these are, as you can imagine, sort of the basis of the zoning code, and then we can build from there. We got general consensus on where we're heading in that area, in those areas, and then we built on that in module 2, focusing on, we did create a historic preservation overlay district, but then focusing on development standards like parking and landscaping, buffers, fences and walls, these sorts of standards that have to do with site plan development. And then finally in module 3, we hit on primarily administrative and procedural matters, but we also wrapped up a few things that were lingering from the first two modules. One was BYOB venues, airport overlay districts, and non-conforming uses. So that module 3 is what we presented in November. And as we heard from you all and from the Planning and Zoning Commission and City Council, for each module, we went back and made changes that were needed. But it's been a very smooth process so far, and we're looking forward to embarking on this part of the project and the eventual adoption by the City Council, as I said, likely in the May or June timeframe. So I'm going to turn it over now, if there are no questions, and let Kelly pick it up from here.
Okay. Thanks, Tyson. Hi, everyone. Thank you for your time tonight. I wanted to start by giving everybody an overview of the documents that are available online. The city staff has been posting everything for each of the modules on the project website, which is the address is linked there on the screen. But you can go online and look back at all of the materials from the previous modules, as well as, you know, all the final draft documents that we're reviewing today. What I'll primarily go over today in terms of the changes are what we see as kind of the biggest changes with respect to the zoning ordinance and the subdivision code. And if you have questions or want to talk more about any of those, we're happy to do that tonight. You can also take a look at the revisions overviews. There's one for each module. Tyson, if you'll click one time, it'll highlight those on the screen. So those are a good place to go and get just a brief overview of some of the major changes that we'll go over tonight. And now I'm going to take you all through a little bit of an explanation about the kind of the main documents that are available for this final review. Starting with the annotated outline. This was something that we put together early in the project. I think it was the same time that we did the assessment that Tyson mentioned. And it lays out the structure and the format of the revised zoning ordinance. So this is a section by section overview of the code. A lot of sections have a description about the purpose or what it carries forward or if it's new. And then the last column there on the outline indicates existing city code sections where we're taking regulations from that section and putting them into the new section of the code. So this is a really good way to get an idea of the revisions to the code, starting with the new format and kind of looking back at the existing code sections. There's also a revisions tracking spreadsheet, which is kind of the reverse of the annotated outline. This tracks based on the structure of the current code. So on the annotated outline slide, you saw the new code sections on the left and the current code sections on the right. Here you've got the current zoning ordinance sections, and then how they relate or where they're located in the new code, and then just a brief description of any revisions that were made, or it could indicate that things have just been carried forward. But that'll give you those two documents, and then the revisions overviews that I mentioned are a really good way to get an idea of exactly what's changed within the zoning ordinance. Next slide. So the revised zoning ordinance is divided into 11 articles plus an executive summary. The standards and requirements that typically are used the most often. So these are zoning districts, use regulations, development standards like parking and landscaping. Those are all towards the front of the code. And then some of the more technical, legal, administrative materials are towards the back of the code. Next slide. So the revised zoning ordinance was prepared in Microsoft Word, and that's what's available on the website for you to download. When you open it up, it'll look like this. Tyson, if you'll click one time, you can see down in the bottom left corner there that there's 371 pages in the zoning ordinance, which is kind of a pain to scroll through if you don't have kind of a table of contents ready. So in Word, Tyson, if you'll click to the next slide, you can get a table of contents to show up on the left-hand side of your screen by going to the View menu at the top, hitting sidebar and then making sure that navigation is checked. And that'll pop up this table of contents on the left-hand side. Next slide. And once that pops up, you can right-click and adjust the level of headings that it'll show. So if you just want a broad overview of the different articles in the code, you hit show heading 2, next slide, and then you can select, show heading 3 or 4, and it'll expand out so that you can see more sections of the code. So this really helps you to navigate the code and find what you're looking for. Next slide. So the use table is something that's in the current zoning ordinance. It's been modified and revised during this process. It now appears at the end of Article 2 following the zoning districts. And when you're looking at the Word file for the zoning ordinance, it's just the use table is an image that's placed in the file. There's also a separate Excel file that's on the website to download that may be a little bit easier to review. Next slide. Okay, so I mentioned we're going to go through some of the top changes. I'm just going to say a couple of brief things about most of these, but if anyone has questions, please feel free to raise your hand and we can stop and talk about any of these things in more detail. So this first list of changes has to do with uses and zoning districts. So we've added a couple of new zoning districts, consolidated others, and we've relocated the city's airport zoning regulations. And I'll talk about all of that in more detail in a few slides. But we've created a code section for each zoning district. So you can go to that section and there's a dimensional standards table that tells you all of the, the minimum lot requirements, setbacks, and those sort of things for each zoning district. There's been some changes to the PD district. We've removed the acreage requirements. Like right now in the code, there's different acreage requirements based on the proposed use in the plan development district, and that no longer applies. So you don't have to have a minimum acreage for a PD district. And I should back up. A lot of the changes that have been proposed to the code hopefully will reduce the need to use PD districts. And so the language in the PD district section has been changed to really focus on those types of developments that are really unique or have a specific public purpose. So it's intended to not be used quite as often, and then when it is used, that there really has to be public purpose, higher quality development than you would typically see in other zoning districts. The code also introduces some new housing types, mainly what planners call missing middle housing types. So these are smaller, multiple family dwelling units like triplexes and quadruplexes that are comparable in scale to single family dwellings so that they can fit in existing neighborhoods or in infill lots, and that allows for some more diversity in housing choice and housing cost. We've also introduced live work dwellings, tiny houses. As I mentioned, we've revised the use table. Right now, the city uses primarily what's called cumulative zoning, where the more intensive districts, like the industrial district, for example, allows most of the uses that are allowed in the less intensive zoning districts. And that's been changed a bit to focus more on the purpose of the district. For example, for industrial districts and the heavier commercial districts, we've proposed removing residential uses just because they're generally not compatible with some of the more intensive industrial uses. But we've also expanded the types of uses that are allowed in some of the other zoning districts. We've added use regulations for several. We've carried forward quite a few, but we've also added some new use regulations for specific uses, and this also helps expand the uses that could be allowed in certain districts because there are conditions or certain regulations associated with them that help them fit better or sort of manage the potential impacts of that use in a particular district. So we've added use, or we've actually carried forward use regulations for accessory dwelling units. Those are already allowed in the city, but we have removed or proposed to remove the requirement that limits them to caretakers and domestic employees, and kind of opens that up so that they could be used for rental units or for other family members. There are use regulations for some of the new housing types I mentioned. We've added regulations for event venues, a new use called corner stores, which is allowed in a couple of the residential districts as a specific use permit that just, it introduces some very, very small, limited in size, commercial and retail uses into neighborhoods. We've added some use regulations for temporary uses. And then as Tyson mentioned, we also worked with staff to develop new regulations for BYOB venues and events, which is kind of an emerging land use in Amarillo that the code didn't address. Next slide. Well, and let me pause there and see if we've got any questions so far. I'm not seeing any hands, so I'll keep going. So this next group of changes is primarily related to development standards, and that was module 2. We've added some graphics to the code, mainly in the section that explains how to measure height, for example, how to measure setbacks, how to calculate density. We have modified the requirements pertaining to lot coverage. Right now, they do not apply to all impervious surfaces, but the so impervious surfaces, so they currently lot coverage does not include parking lots, for example, parking areas. There was a recommendation in the comprehensive plan to calculate lot coverage based on all impervious surfaces. So that change is proposed. We've clarified when fences and walls are required. We've added provisions for buffer yards that could be used as an alternative to fences and walls, just as an alternative screening requirement. We've updated the parking ratios. So this is, the number of parking spaces required per dwelling unit or per square foot of commercial, and tried to bring those in line with today's best practices. We've carried a lot of the ratios forward. We've also added some parking incentives for infill and adaptive reuse, as well as in neighborhood plan areas. We've added a provision for the zoning administrator to be able to adjust the required parking ratio by up to 10%. And I forgot to mention, we've also introduced parking maximums. So there is a minimum number of spaces required, but there's also a maximum, and that it allows some flexibility for developers to accommodate the proposed uses on their lot, but it helps prevent having too much parking. The revised zoning ordinance also introduces some outdoor lighting requirements. These are fairly simple and straightforward and really just intended to manage glare and light trespass across property lines. We've also updated the performance standards that apply to industrial uses. Those are largely carried forward, but just updated to, fit with current standards. Next slide. Okay, and so this group, this is some of the top changes we identified in module 3, the procedures and administrative module. The biggest thing was that the revised zoning ordinance consolidates all of the procedures into one article, and it has added a common workflow for each of those. So you go in and look at any of the procedures that are listed, like a rezoning or an SUP, and it has sections just like what you see listed on the right there. So for each procedure, you can see exactly when it applies, how you start the process, how the process works, what the approval criteria are, and then what that approval authorizes you to do. There's a new comprehensive plan amendment procedure. This procedure would allow a property owner to request a change to the comprehensive plan's future land use and character map as it pertains to their property. All of the application submittal requirements have been consolidated into the last article in the zoning ordinance. And there's a big matrix, basically a big table of all of the application requirements. And there are two tables actually. One is for applications that go to a board and commission, and those will be in the zoning ordinance. And then there's a separate matrix for administrative approvals, staff level approvals that staff will maintain outside of the zoning ordinance so that they can update it as needed. But that is there, both of those matrices are available on the website for review. The zoning ordinance also proposes new provisions for traffic impact analysis that would apply to developments that hit a certain trigger, a certain number of vehicle trips during peak hours. Anything over 100 peak hour vehicle trips would be required to do a traffic impact analysis that could potentially result in recommendations for mitigation for a particular project, turn lane, for example. And so the city can work with the developers to mitigate traffic impacts caused by new development. We've also codified requirements pertaining to technical reports and studies. At times, boards and commission, planning and zoning commission, city council may ask for more information about a particular application. They may ask for some sort of report or study. And this, we've added provisions in the code that specify what types of reports and studies can be requested and with what type of application. So again, this just codifies something that the city was already doing, but it makes it clear to applicants, you know, the other types of materials that could be required based on the type of development. And then finally, nonconformities, which Tyson mentioned earlier. The biggest change here is change in use. Currently, nonconforming uses, if they're abandoned for more than a year, they cannot be reestablished, and proposed in the revised zoning ordinances to change that to 6 months. We've also added some provisions for non-conforming site improvements, like landscaping, for example. The current code addresses non-conforming lots and uses, but not those site improvements. So we've made that clarification as well. Next slide. Okay, I mentioned the zoning map earlier. Tyson, if you'll click once. Okay, so there are 3 new districts. One is a base district and the other 2 are overlays. The estate district is something that's recommended by the comprehensive plan, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. We've added a new historic preservation overlay district. That district is not mapped. It is available for property owners to request, and it's also something that the city could initiate. There's also proposed is an urban neighborhood overlay, which we've got a slide on that too, so you can see the location, but it essentially surrounds the downtown area and adds some permitted uses and higher densities in that area. Tyson, if you'll click again. We are consolidating some districts, R2 and R3, MF1 and MF2, and then O1 and O2. Those are all being consolidated from 6 districts into 3. And click one more time. I say this is a relocated district because the city already has airport zoning regulations. They're just in a different chapter of the city code. So we have brought those into the zoning ordinance and created this airport overlay district. And I'll talk about that more in a second too. Next slide. So we did want to mention the effect of these zoning changes on existing PDs and SUPs. There are no proposed changes to existing PDs. Those individual PD ordinances will continue to apply. Any changes to the PDs will have to go through the process. There are no proposed changes to existing SUPs either. However, the base zoning district will change if it's one of the consolidated districts. So for example, if you have an SUP on an MF2 zoned property, your SUP will not change, but your underlying zoning would be MF after this consolidation. Next slide. So this graphic on the right is from the assessment, and we looked at the acreage of land area that's in each zoning district. And we saw that the two office districts and multifamily 2 and multifamily 1, but to a lesser degree, were all some of the least used zoning districts in the city. So it made sense to consolidate those. So we're putting MF1 and MF2 together, and generally carrying forward the MF1 development standards like setback and height. Same for the office districts. Now with R2 and R3, the current districts have a lot of similarities in terms of permitted uses, SUP uses, setbacks, that sort of thing. So it makes sense to combine them. So we're proposing to do that, to combine them in R2 and R3 into an R2 district. However, the dimensional standards will be the same as the current R3 district. So if your property's R3 now, essentially it's a name change. You're going to be R2 and the same development standards will continue to apply. If you're R2 now, the name of your zoning district won't change, but the underlying development standards will. And they're the lot area, minimum lot area and setback requirements for R3 are less than they are in R2, which should prevent any non-conforming lots resulting from this consolidation. Next slide. So the historic preservation overlay is new. It aligns with the Secretary of Interior standards. There are two processes, one to establish a historic preservation overlay district. So this would be multiple properties. And then there's also an ability to designate landmarks. So that would be a single property or building. As I mentioned, this overlay district is not mapped, but it is available for implementation in the future. The estate district is a brand new district, a base district that corresponds to the future land use and character map designation for estate residential. The areas recommended for that are primarily along the edges of the city, where the city's starting to see annexation and starting to see a little, more development. So this is sort of a transitional area between agricultural districts and the more intensive residential and commercial districts in the city. The proposed rezonings are currently under staff review. We're working with staff to finalize the list. Because the future land use and character map was adopted, I think it was 2010. So obviously some things have changed, and there are certain areas that may not be appropriate for estate residential anymore. And there are some areas that may not have been recommended for that, but are appropriate for that. So we're looking at that closely now. Next slide. But generally, this is the future land use and character map. So if you'll click one more time, Tyson, you can see the estate residential is that lighter yellow color that primarily you'll see at the north, south, and southwest areas of the city. Next slide. Okay, here's the map of the urban neighborhood overlay. I know it is a little hard to see, but it's shown in the green hatch, and it generally surrounds the central business district, and it does overlap with the downtown urban design district. So this district does apply to all properties that are within the boundaries, regardless of the base zoning district. It doesn't add any restrictions to properties. It actually adds additional permitted uses and a higher density than is typically allowed. So in addition to all of the uses that are allowed by the base zoning district, all uses in the, or all properties in the urban neighborhood overlay would be allowed to also have multiple family dwellings, live work dwellings, and mixed use buildings. And those are all allowed as a permitted use without having to go through the SUP process, for example. And then the maximum density is proposed to be 50 dwelling units an acre. Next slide. The airport overlay district, I mentioned the city's airport zoning regulations are in chapter 4.9 now. So we've brought those forward and we've worked with airport staff and their consultant to update the overlay district regulations, excuse me, and the boundaries to coincide with the current airport master plan and the current impacts from the airport. So this continues to apply in both the city and the city's extraterritorial jurisdiction. The benefit of us bringing it into the zoning ordinance is that now it's shown on the zoning map. So we've added that boundary to the zoning map so you can see whether your property falls in that or not. Next slide. Okay, and we have, so we've also made some amendments to the city's subdivision ordinance. There was some legislation at the state level that was approved a year or two ago called the shot clock bill, which basically sets a time frame for local governments to approve certain types of development applications, subdivision plats. So we've revised the approval procedures and timeframes for consistency with that new state law. With respect to alleys, we've revised the subdivision ordinance to authorize the Planning and Zoning Commission to determine when alleys are required. There are some criteria in the code, including, looking at how the rest of the section and adjoining areas have developed. But that is a big change, so alleys will no longer necessarily be required. Drainage plan requirements have been revised to require a plan for development in all non-residential zoning districts, regardless of the number of lots. I think currently there's a 3 or 4 lot limit before you have to do the drainage plan. So now all non-residential development will have to do a drainage plan. We've also added a provision related to stormwater ponds in the airport overlay. This ties back to a new zone that we added in consultation with airport staff. So it just adds a requirement for how stormwater detention ponds have to be built so that they are less likely to attract birds and other wildlife that could present a hazard to pilots. Next slide. We've also updated the city's adequate public facilities policy to add a provision for a written agreement or approval between the city and a developer when public facilities are provided under that policy. And we've also specified that payment, dedication, or construction of those public facilities cannot exceed the developer's proportionate share based on, the proposed development. We've also codified the city's policy for dedication of parkland in new subdivisions, and then just made some minor edits to department names and staff titles. Next slide. All right, back to Tyson, unless anyone has questions.
I'm not seeing any hands raised at this point. So I'll wrap us up here. Thank you, Kelly. As I said earlier, this is going to be the first of a number of meetings that will probably run through May, if not June. If you heard anything you're interested in tonight, but you have more questions about, I'll give you some contact information here at the end of the session, and you can pass those questions along to the city staff, and if they can't answer them, they'll pass them along to us, and we'll make sure they are answered. There's a lot of material that's been changed over the last year and a half, and our hope is that you'll take the time to take a look at it, see how it's going to affect your property or your business. If there's anything at all that's not clear to you, please let us have the opportunity to explain it, or at least explain where we're coming from. Remember, the final adoption of these changes will be up to the city council. This is just what we and staff have recommended based on our input, on the input that we've received and the work that we've done, but it'd be ultimately up to them. And One thing I would say I know will be of significant interest as we go along is the zoning map revisions. As Kelly said, those are being finalized. As you can see here on this slide, we'll be meeting in a workshop with the Planning and Zoning Commission in about 2 weeks on the 22nd. And we hope by that point we'll have the map finalized, or the proposed map finalized. And that would be an opportunity to see if the zoning on your property has been proposed for a change. Most of those changes, by the way, as Kelly pointed out, are associated with those estate districts on the edges of town that are largely rural or transitioning rural now. I mentioned earlier, but we'll have another public meeting this Thursday night, same time, same place. The link to that is on the city's website. And as I said, we'll meet with the Planning and Zoning Commission in a workshop format in a couple of weeks. And then following that, Planning and Zoning Commission will make a recommendation to the City Council as we move into the few months following. And there'll be 2 hearings, 2 readings by the City Council before final adoption. If you do have questions, pass them along to Chris Valverde, who's going to get back on the horn here in a second. And as I said, he'll pass them along to us if he doesn't want to answer them himself or can't explain our thinking. And I hope, Kelly gave you an overview of the documents that are on the website. So I think you can make your way through those and let us know if there are any questions, and we'll see you as we move through this process over the next couple of months.
All right, Tyson, thank you. And again, just pause a few moments and see if anybody does have any questions. Again, if you could use the raise hand feature and go ahead and do that and indicate that you do have some questions. If not, again, as Tyson said, there's several opportunities ahead to ask those questions if you do, if some do come up. But if not, we will adjourn the meeting. Just give it a few moments, everyone, if we can.
Sure.
Tyson, I don't see any indication that anybody has any questions right now. So with that, we'll wrap it up, and I appreciate everybody coming out.
Okay, good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.